Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. You know, I've had the great privilege to live my life at the intersection of the public, private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As a lawyer, CEO of two nonprofit organizations, and as a state legislator, attorney general, and lieutenant governor. And the lessons I've learned come down to just two words: justice and leadership. That's why every week we'll talk to people who are walking the walk. Some are lawyers and some are not, but all of them have something in common. They are change makers. They are guardians of justice. They are living justice, and they are living leadership. Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm Lee Fisher, the host of this podcast, and I could not be more excited about my guest today. My guest is the 67th governor of the state of Ohio. And when I tell you his name, I'm sure it will ring a bell, because it is someone who is well known throughout Ohio. His name is Bob Taft. Bob Taft not only served as the 67th governor of Ohio, but he served in public office for 30 years. But what many people don't know is that before he began those 30 years in elected public office, he actually began his public service as a Peace Corps volunteer, working as a school teacher in Tanzania, in East Africa, right after graduating from Yale University. He went on to get his master's degree in government from Princeton and his law degree from the University of Cincinnati. Bob Taft's first job in government was with the Bureau of the Budget in the state of Illinois. He has been a member of the Ohio legislature from 1976 to 1981. He was a Hamilton County commissioner. For those of you who don't know where Hamilton County is, that's Cincinnati. And he was a commissioner there from 1981 to 1990. He served 2 terms as Secretary of State. In fact, he was elected Secretary of State in 1990, the same year that I was elected as Attorney General. And we'll talk about that a little because we used to play softball against each other, and we'll talk about who won those games. And, of course, he served for 2 terms as the governor of Ohio. After that, my recollection, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, Bob, is that you actually went back to Tanzania for a trip with your wife, Hope, after you finished your time as governor. To see
a great memory.
I remember that, to see how East Africa might have changed. Since then, he has been at the University of Dayton as a distinguished research associate, teaching political science courses and working with state and federal internship programs. That's a long introduction. Welcome, Bob Taft.
Thanks, Lee. It's great to be with you.
Bob, I want to begin on a more personal note, and that is how you and your wife, Hope Taft, have been handling this past year. It's been difficult for all of us, and all of us deal with it differently. How have you been able to deal with it both personally and professionally?
Well, fortunately, I spend a lot of time outside, and Hope's getting into walking, so we're both outside a lot of the time. I do a lot of cycling. I play golf, as you know, so I've been very fortunate that we've been able to continue a lot of our activities without too many constraints. You know, obviously we miss, sitting down with friends, having lunch, having coffees, just hanging out with people. We've seen people, from time to time in very small numbers. Maybe having a couple over or something like that, distanced and masked. But other than that, it's been all right. I've had to learn, as many have, how to teach on Zoom. Done a lot of Zoom classes, especially last spring. Although University of Dayton is now pretty much back in person, which is fortunate. So it's been a learning curve, a challenge. But I think that we've been very fortunate, not as affected as so many families have been in the state of Ohio.
I know that you and Hope both are outdoors people because I get your holiday card every year, and it always are pictures of you outside. I recall that Hope, of course, is a gardener and did something very unusual at the governor's residence. Will you talk about that for a second? Our listeners probably don't know much about that.
Yeah, Hope, along with some experts, created an Ohio native plants garden depicting all the growing zones of Ohio. And still today is in charge of that project, still is up there in the summer with a lot of other master gardeners. They're weeding the garden, they're taking care of it. Somehow that garden has survived through 3 governors, which is kind of amazing, because governors are in charge of the governor's residence, right? As long as they're governor. But it's a showcase really for Ohio native plants from all across the state. It's a great place for students to go and learn. Or if you've got a garden group out there, if you've got a garden club, they love to have tours and show off the garden. And Ohio is an amazingly diverse state, as you know, Lee. And our flora and fauna, our plants are also incredibly diverse and interesting. So that's one of her babies. That's her pet project.
And in fact, it's probably a bipartisan garden, given the fact that both Democrat and Republican governors have both supported it. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. Frances Strickland, who was when First Lady, when Ted was there, she was a terrific supporter of the garden and really encouraged and enabled Hope to continue her interest.
Bob, is there an affinity with other governors that you've had in Ohio? I'm curious. What's the life of an ex-governor when it comes to dealing with past governors, whether they be John Kasich or Dick Celeste, John Gilligan when he was still alive, Ted Strickland? Do you all get together? Do you ever talk to each other? What kind of relationship do you have?
Well, when I was governor, I tried to reach out a little bit to former Governor Gilligan, and the family goes way back because my dad had a really knockdown, drag-out congressional battle against John Gilligan.
I remember that.
But I was, personally, liked Gilligan, admired him, served with his daughter, who was governor of Kansas, Kathleen Sebelius.
Yes.
And when they had a dinner honoring Jack Gilligan, the Democrats did in Columbus, and I was governor. I actually crashed the dinner, went in and said a few nice words about Jack Gilligan because he was quite a historic governor in the state of Ohio. I've known Ted Celeste for a long time, ever since he was lieutenant governor, going back.
You mean Dick Celeste, not Ted Celeste?
Excuse me, not Ted.
You combine Ted too. You combine Ted Strickland with Dick Celeste.
Thanks for being sharp there, correcting my aging brain. But Dick and I go way back, and we served on the board of a nonprofit on education, Patel for Kids, here in Ohio for a number of years, and always have kept in touch with him. He and I were involved in a small effort to help expedite the testing for COVID for Governor DeWine. And of course, he went into academia too, like both of us did, as president of Colorado College. So I've had a good relationship with him, good relationship with Ted Strickland, done a lot of work with him as well over the years. I was very close to Governor Vornovich when he was still living, and a good friend, a mentor for me, really, a great supporter, great guy, great governor. And so we would see each other from time to time until his untimely death. But it's not a fraternity, but close relationships and a lot of respect.
Even though we're going to talk a lot about politics and government on this podcast today, I want to also talk about the personal side of Bob Taft. And so I want to start back in Tanzania and the Peace Corps and tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, that was just an incredible opportunity for me coming out of college. I wasn't sure I wanted to go to law school. The Peace Corps was new, an initiative of President, of course, John F. Kennedy, who inspired a lot of us in that day. And I did a little traveling, never lived in another country. So I thought it would be a really great opportunity. And I enjoyed Peace Corps training a lot with people from all over the country, posted out to a small village in northern Tanzania near Lake Victoria with another Peace Corps teacher. 6 teachers ran the school, a lot of responsibility, a lot of opportunity, really kind of fell in love with teaching. And I've had an interest in education and education policy ever since then. It was an interesting decision for me to make since my dad was in Congress as a Republican. Of course, the Peace Corps was a Democratic idea, a John F. Kennedy idea. So, and my parents thought I was supposed to go to law school, but I disappointed them. I don't think they were too happy with that decision. But the good news is that after my dad lost in 1964 a U.S. Senate race against Stephen Young, which you'll remember.
I do.
He and my mom came out and actually visited me at the school in Tanzania. That was kind of a really a fun high point for the school and for me. And so I think they understand the benefit and the value of me doing Peace Corps.
And after you left the governorship, didn't you hope go back in 2007? What was that like?
Well, in fact, the day I left the governor's office, I got out of Dodge, and we were on an airplane
Really, the
back
same day?
same day back to
That's
Tanzania,
amazing.
and we spent a month just traveling all over the country. We went back to the school, which had transformed into a kind of a career tech program, different from what we were there, but it was very interesting. There was more electricity, there was more, better roads and that kind of thing. But there was still a lot of poverty. And when I was there, it was before the AIDS epidemic. But when we went back in 2007, there still was the AIDS epidemic was having a big impact across the country. Still a lot of poverty, a relatively peaceful country, but still working its way up the line in terms of opportunity and prosperity.
But I also want to talk about what it's been like to grow up in, I think it's fair to say, a famous family. There are very few families in American politics that are extremely well known. The Kennedys, obviously, I think the Bushes to some extent. But I actually would argue that the best known family in America in politics is actually the Taft family. And it's very distinguished. My recollection is your great grandfather was President of the United States and Chief Justice of the United States, which is pretty amazing. I could be wrong. The only person I can remember who was President and Chief Justice. Your father, of course, was very distinguished United States Senator. He lost that race against Stephen Young, but won later in the Senate. And your grandfather, I believe, was also the U.S. Senate Majority Leader. I got to believe that it's a blessing, but it's also a burden as well. And I'd love to hear about both.
Well, the older I get, the more interested I get in the family. When you're young, you want to strike it on your own
Of course.
and, establish yourself and so forth. But actually, it goes back to President Taft's dad, who a guy named Alfonso Taft, happens to be my middle name, who served in President Grant's cabinet as Secretary of War and also Attorney General under Grant, and was ambassador to Austria-Hungary and Russia after that. So he actually ran for governor of Ohio, never got the Republican nomination. He was a judge in Cincinnati. But when I was growing up, it wasn't pushed on me. It wasn't forced on me too much. But I do remember visiting my grandfather, who was a leader in the Senate, back in the 1950s. And my earliest real political memory is of the Republican National Convention, 1952, when my grandfather sought the presidency, and it was very close, could have been the candidate, but for Ike. General Eisenhower, of course, a war hero, came back, and the Eisenhower forces outdueled the Taft forces at the convention in Chicago in 1952. Very exciting, dramatic convention. I wasn't there, but I watched it on television. That was one of the first televised conventions. So I had that memory, forever. I've had that memory. And then I really enjoyed getting to know more about William Howard Taft, as you mentioned, both Chief Justice and President of the United States. Never wanted to be president, always wanted to be Chief Justice, hated being president, loved being Chief Justice. And so I have a lot of fun with him. I've got a great little slideshow for fourth graders, to learn about Ohio history on William Howard Taft, because he's an interesting character.
I should have asked you to bring those slides to this podcast. I'd like to see that myself. Tell us a little bit more about your father, who was a well-known United States Senator from Ohio.
Yeah. My dad, like the family, we don't start at the top. You work your way up, right? So like me, he started in the state legislature as a young, attorney from Cincinnati, served there, worked into leadership, and then was elected congressman at large in Ohio because they couldn't decide how to redistrict the state. So there was an at-large member of the U.S. House, very unusual, ran against a guy named Kennedy, interestingly enough, and was congressman at large, served in Congress, and then, as I mentioned, he ran in '64, the Goldwater Johnson year, and tough year to run as a Republican. He lost that race, but then was elected in 1970 to the Senate. So he served, a number of years in the House and 6 years in the U.S. Senate, and was involved in some labor law reform legislation, like his dad. And I would say, supported civil rights laws. He was more of the old style kind of, I would say, moderate Republican back in those days. But kind of a quiet, unassuming guy, labored in the shadow of his dad, who was, famous. I mean, Robert A. Taft was on the cover of Time and Life magazine, and looked back in those days. And so I think that was a challenge for my dad, but he handled it with, I think, great dignity and perseverance, and had a very solid political and elected office career of his own.
Even though you said that you were not pushed into politics, did you grow up feeling a sense of obligation and responsibility to have a public service career?
Well, I think it was, I was aware of the responsibilities of coming from a well-known family. And like you say, it was an opportunity when I got into politics, a little bit of a burden. You want to try to live up to the family reputation on the one hand. On the other hand, you want to establish yourself on your own merits, on your own accomplishments. So yeah, you're always very aware of that. And I can remember, having some political debates with my family when I went off to college and came home with all those new ideas, as we all do. But I've kind of, the older I get, the more accustomed I've gotten to it. Obviously now I've had a career of my own, so and really enjoyed my career. So I feel a lot more comfortable being really interested in what the family did and the family history. And I've spent some time reading up on even my great grandfather Alfonso Taft, who was in President Grant's cabinet, and also President Taft as well.
Was your decision to go into the Peace Corps, in a sense, sending a message to those in your family and others that, hey, I may enter a life of public service, but I'm going to do it my way?
Well, I think that's very perceptive. And it's important. You mentioned public service. I think I was always, because of my family, moving in that direction of public service as opposed to the private sector.
Right.
And that's where my fulfillment could come. And yeah, I think that the decision to join the Peace Corps, we all make our little, rebellions against our family or our family history or whatever, strike out on our own. So that was my effort to do that, I think.
And the irony of it is it probably made you a much better public office holder having done that.
Oh, absolutely. It was a great experience. I mean, in Peace Corps training, I met people from all over the country, all walks of life, who were in my group, and that was a very broadening experience for me. And then to learn how people live in other parts of the world, and also, as I mentioned, getting involved in education, and something that carried through my whole career.
One more question about on the personal side, and then we'll move to politics, and that is, tell us a little bit about your wife, Hope, who we've talked a little bit about already, and also your daughter, Anna.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, Hope is from southern Arkansas. We met in the airport in Guatemala City, of all things. And she didn't know what she was getting into, marrying a guy that might go into politics, but heck of a trooper. I mean, she walked door to door. She did the whole thing, the parades, everything else. So I've been blessed. And then when she was first lady, she was a very active first lady, not just the garden, but, substance abuse, trying to deal with that, helping our young people grow up healthy and strong, and promoting volunteerism. So she embraced the role of first lady, and she's still very active, both with the governor's garden that you mentioned, but also protecting the Little Miami River watershed where we live now, and also with our daughter's foundation, which has projects in Ecuador and Mali. It's called the Tandana Foundation, and that's what our daughter does. She runs the Tandana Foundation, which has some really fascinating development projects, volunteer vacations, medical vacations to Ecuador in the non-COVID era, of course, and some fascinating programs in Mali, Mali, in West Africa, working with women's groups and helping communities grow and prosper.
Did Hope or Anna ever consider running for public office?
Hope would never do that. She's much too smart to run for public office. And Anna, she got a little bit politicized via Trump, because everybody got politicized in the whole country via Trump. But I don't think she'll ever run for office. She's doing really great work with her foundation.
If somebody were to ask me, what would be the ideal name for the ideal candidate for public office, I would say Hope Taft.
Yeah,
So she may
yeah.
not have any interest in running, but it's the best name I could think of to be successful in politics in Ohio would be Hope Taft,
Yeah,
even
I think
better
that
than
might
Bob
work.
Taft.
I think that might work.
That's right. Now let's move a little bit to politics, and let's start about talk about the beginning of your career. What was being in the state legislature like? You said your father started there. You started there. Any memories from your days in the state legislature?
Well, first of all, it was humbling because Republicans were in the minority back then, Lee, as you
Ah,
recall.
yes. Those are
And
the days
so
of Vern Rife as the
we
speaker.
got
Am I right?
outvoted by the Democrats every time, and Vern Rife was the Speaker of the House. Talk about power in one
Yes.
person. It was unbelievable. I mean, he really set the agenda, and he ran things, and he ran the show, and it was interesting to observe it, to learn it, to dig into some of the issues. I was on the tax committee, Ways and Means, on the finance committee, so learn more about the state budget. So it was a great learning experience. But 5 years in the minority, that was probably about enough. So that's when I went home and ran for county commissioner down in Cincinnati.
And what about county commissioner? What was that like? Because you were in that position for quite a long time.
That's a tough job. County government up there in Cleveland, you've got a single executive now, which makes more sense. But almost all the other counties except Summit, which is Akron, have a three-headed monster where you got three people being the chief executive and trying to work together, two people as a majority. You have county administrators who really have no power, and it's not a very functional system of government. But I enjoyed being at home. That's when our daughter was born. I could spend more time with my family, and learning county government was a good experience because criminal justice, the counties are deeply into that. Human services, children's services programs, very important. Just learning about land use and zoning and those local issues gives you an additional perspective on government overall, and also the role of the state in supervising and overseeing and setting the laws under which local governments operate.
My recollection, and correct me if I'm wrong, is back in 1990, you were considering running for governor, but eventually ran for Secretary of State. What's the story behind that?
Well, that's exactly right. In 1989, I started running for governor. Mike DeWine started running for governor back then. George Voinovich started running for governor. We were all roaming around
Isn't that
Ohio,
ironic?
running into each other at McDonald's, as we shaved or changed clothes or whatever you had to do about that thing. And then, Voinovich had run before, lost in the Senate, so he'd been around the track. He was more experienced. He got together with DeWine on a ticket. I actually had a lieutenant governor candidate, Dorothy Teeter, who was a county commissioner out of Franklin County.
Yes, I remember her. Yes,
but they just had a leg up on us. They were doing better with fundraising. They were getting more county endorsements. They kind of were more experienced in running a statewide campaign. So, and also Republicans needed candidates down the ticket. So particularly Secretary of State, as you recall, because Secretary of State, auditor, governor sit on the board that draws district lines for legislative districts. So that was a priority. So a lot of pressure on me from the state chairman, even the National Republican Party, to get out of the governor's race and run for Secretary of State. And that's what I did.
Well, I think history will also show you were very gracious in doing that. You might have been pressured, but you didn't have to do it. And frankly,
yeah.
And I was just going to say, even though George Voinovich and Mike DeWine was a powerful ticket, Bob Taft was a powerful and formidable opponent as well. And you could very well have continued in that race and perhaps have won it. It would have been harder, but you could have done it. So in the end, I think that it was a smart political decision because I think the party later felt this is somebody who's earned the right to run for governor.
I think that's a really, really astute comment and quite accurate. Also, personally, it worked out better for me from a personal standpoint because our daughter was in 7th grade when I was starting as Secretary of State. So your schedule is much more your own when you're Secretary of State than when you're governor. So I could spend more time with family. And also, after 2 terms as Secretary of State, I was a lot readier to know what I was doing as governor. And I think, could be more effective. I knew more of the people, I knew more of the players, knew more about the issues.
I have a political trivia question for our audience. It's a 2-part question. 1, how many races has Sherrod Brown lost in his career? And number 2, I'll give you the answer to the first one. It was 1. And who did he lose to? And for those of you who don't know the answer, it's my guest today, Bob Taft. The incumbent Secretary of State in Ohio was Sherrod Brown in 1990. and he was upset by Bob Taft. Tell us about that race, because it's a famous race.
Oh, that was a brutal race. Taft was a strong name, but Brown, so many people named Brown had served in Ohio. So, Taft Brown, it's about 50-50 when you start off.
Clash of the Titans, I agree.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so we had to build a campaign from scratch, figure out what we were doing, hire consultants. And we had some really knockdown, drag out debates. And he came into Hamilton County to try to rough us up, and we had to defend our record in Hamilton County. And then, it was the battle of the ads. And we had an ad called Steinar Sherrod that dealt with some of the issues that they'd encountered in the office under Sherrod Brown. I think we had a more effective ad campaign. They kept changing the ads all the time, and we were more consistent and coherent. And, people don't like negativity, but if you're not the incumbent, you have to make the case that the incumbent shouldn't be reelected. So that's what you have to do. So that's what we did. And I'm not exactly proud of those ads. They weren't the most enlightening ads, I would say. But we worked hard, we fought hard, and we won, with a pretty small margin. He was a very strong opponent, and of course, he landed on his feet because Sherrod went on to be a U.S. congressman and now our U.S. senator.
Well, it's ironic because that ad, I'm sure, was considered in its day negative, but compared to the negative ads of today, that was extremely mild.
That's a good point, and it had a lot of humor in it.
It was almost cartoonish, I remember.
And that's maybe why it was successful.
Sherrod, as Secretary of State, I think, had taken a trip to Japan, and you took advantage of that. Even if it was a legitimate trip, you took advantage of it, and it was a very effective ad. And the reason I know that is that Bob Taft and I were elected to statewide office the same year. When you were elected Secretary of State, I had the honor of being elected Attorney General, but my race was much closer than yours. I won against Paul Pfeiffer, who later became a member of the Ohio Supreme Court, in the closest political race in Ohio history, and that race still stands. Now I'm going to give you a little political trivia. Ask you, do you remember what my margin of victory was, Bob? If you don't remember, I'll tell you in a second.
Well, I'm going to guess that, and this is wrong, but I'm going to guess it was 1,234 votes.
Okay, Bob Taft obviously knows his politics too well. I thought maybe I could stump him today, but I couldn't. But he's right. My margin was 1, 2, 3, 4. That's
no
right.
way. Was that what you're kidding? Oh my God.
It was 1,234 votes out of 3.5 million, which was less than one vote per precinct.
That's why they called you Landslide Lee.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Landslide Lee. So
I also want to mention, in fairness to Sherrod Brown, he agreed to go to Japan for like 2 months or something, like a sabbatical from Secretary of State. He caught a lot of flack and he ended up not going, but we still had it in the ad.
Oh, I didn't even realize he didn't go.
Right.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay,
in fairness to our U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown.
I like that. Who, by the way, now has come and been a guest teacher at some of your classes, as I recall, right?
Yeah, he's been very gracious and very supportive, and we've been delighted to have him at the University of Dayton.
Tell us about your time as Secretary of State. You served 2 4-year terms.
Yeah, I love the job of Secretary of State. As you know, you work with these 88 county boards of elections, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats on every board. You get to know those folks pretty well, so you get a good knowledge of the local politics around the state of Ohio. It's got a judicial aspect to it because the Secretary of State breaks tie votes. We have to break tie votes on all kinds of issues, including whether or not to count certain ballots. The old punch card system, where they maybe put the punch card in upside down, and can you determine voter intent? That kind of stuff. We had to break tie votes on who would be the director of the Board of Elections in Cuyahoga County, where I went with a Democrat in one case, a guy named Tom Hayes, very difficult administrator, who ended up saving us when we had problems as governor in the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. He came in and ran that department. So I
remember, yeah.
It was a fun job. It was a good opportunity to promote voter registration. We promoted a kids voting program where kids would actually go to vote in the polls, kind of separate from their parents, but go in and have an actual election and promote voter registration. We recognized longtime voters, like people who voted for 50 consecutive years, and longtime poll workers too, in each of the 88 counties in Ohio. So, man, did I see the state.
Starting in 2000 with the Bush versus Gore race, the focus in national politics has been more on Secretary of States than ever in its history because of close presidential elections and also allegations of voter suppression. What's your thought about the role of Secretary of States these days and how it's changed since the time you served?
You are so correctly. I mean, it was relatively quiet. I mean, I wouldn't say backwater, but it wasn't so controversial before Bush v. Gore. And after that race and what happened in Florida down there, and some of my staff went down there to help on the Republican side, I remember. But just all hell broke loose after that. And Secretary of State started getting sued right, left, and center. And it became, Secretary of State job became, as you said, far more visible, far more controversial, far more scrutinized. A microscope would be put up to every decision that was made by a Secretary of State. We've seen that. We saw that in the presidential election this year, especially.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little because there have been allegations, I think reasonable allegations, that the Republican Party generally has engaged in a lot of activities that some people would view as trying to suppress the vote and make it harder to vote. Now, obviously, the other view of that is, no, it's just adding integrity to the system. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you have to have integrity because you have to have public confidence in the outcome of elections. So that's very, very important. On the other hand, you want to encourage people to vote and make that as convenient, as simple as possible. So, those are conflicting roles, and where do you strike the balance? And my view is that Ohio has a pretty good balance, that we haven't gone overboard, that you do have to identify yourself, but there's a variety of different ways in Ohio where you have to identify yourself, and it should make it possible for virtually everyone to cast their ballot, and we have ways to deal with people who maybe show up with improper identification. You don't count their ballot. They vote, but they don't count your ballot right away. So I think Ohio has set the right balance. I think some states went overboard and were too restrictive in terms of, requiring, photo IDs and other requirements to vote. So I think that voters, I think that made it possible for this term voter suppression to rise, particularly right on the Democratic side. And I think it was used somewhat as a political issue, but that's not to say that some states didn't go too far in restricting it. There is obviously there is some voter fraud. I don't believe we've ever had large scale, massive, organized, coordinated voter fraud that influenced elections in the state of Ohio. And that really hasn't happened, to my knowledge. You have to guard against it, but where it happens, it's usually pretty small scale stuff. It did impact a race in North Carolina, a congressional race a couple of years ago, where they actually had to rerun the election. But that's the exception, not the rule.
In fact, you may recall that in 1990, in that race that I won, after I won the recount, Paul Pfeiffer filed a case in the Ohio Supreme Court alleging fraud in Mahoning County that he said would have changed the result. And I got inaugurated in 3 months, but I really couldn't unpack my boxes because that case was pending in the House Supreme Court. 90 days later, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that I could unpack my boxes. But that was one of the first election contests alleging fraud on a statewide basis.
Well, when it comes down to 1,000 votes in a state like Ohio,
that's right.
Then it could have an impact. But most races aren't that close.
Would it be fair to say that the highlight of your career as Secretary of State were the softball games against the Attorney General's office?
There is no question that was the most fun, enjoyable time. I don't think we won them all, but we lost some, we won some. And I still have a memory of one Attorney General Lee Fisher smashing a pitch into deep left field. And a young female staffer from our office, lo and behold, caught the damn thing.
That's great. Well,
that's one of my memories.
And I only tell half that story. I tell people about the fact that I hit it long. I don't tell everybody about anybody caught it.
That was a long ball, man. That was a long ball. Yeah. You were. You obviously were a professional baseball player.
Hardly. My recollection is that we played twice and we split. You won one and we won one, and I still have a softball autographed by you in the game that we won. I still have that among my memorabilia.
That was a lot of fun. That was one of the best things we did.
By the way, I remember that softball game very well, and it was a lot of fun. I think that Bob Taft was a great Secretary of State, but I think I was a little better baseball player. But of course, I get to rewrite that history, so who knows? So I would like you to tune in next time, because then we're going to talk about Governor Taft's time as the governor of the state of Ohio and his views on the future of the Republican Party. Stay tuned.